talk on Sangharakshita as a model of applying the middle way. So this really is a talk that ties in with my personal experience and my recent book, which I'll hold up to start with. So the Thought of Sangharakshita, a critical assessment, came out last year, published by Equinox. And that book came out of, I suppose, a process of sort of returning to Triratna and Sangharakshita and a set of ideas and conditions and practices that had a big effect on me earlier in my life, which I suppose I now see as something of a transitional stage in many ways, but that which led me eventually on to developing middle way philosophy and starting the Middle Way Society. But after doing all that, I felt the need to re-engage with Sangharakshita in order to clarify my approach to him and find a balance in that approach particularly. So hence it was an exercise in practice, really, in trying to apply the middle way in my own judgments, and I thought writing it all down might help other people in the same way. So that's where the book came from, and then that's also where this talk comes from. So the wider retreat that we're in at the moment is focused on Buddhist perspectives on the middle way, and obviously Sangharakshita also offers one of those perspectives. But in order to engage with or make the best use of what Sangharakshita has or had to offer, I think it helps to get a sense of the sorts of positive but critical approaches we could take to him. It's an exercise in what I sometimes call separating the wheat from the chaff. So applying a critical perspective to be really positive about what's positive and what we can make use of positively, but also clear about what we don't want to adopt. Let me say a little bit first of all about who Sangharakshita was for those who were not familiar with him. So it's just a few of the basics. I won't go on at great length. So Sangharakshita lived from 1925 to 2018. And he was the founder of the Triratna movement and Triratna order, which was previously known as the Western Buddhist order and Friends of the Western Buddhist order. He came from South London, was brought up in a working class household, and then spent 20 years in India, where he was activated by a strong kind of intuitive interest in Buddhism. He rapidly became an ordained Buddhist monk. But he returned to the UK in the late 1960s, where he founded what was then the Friends of the Western Buddhist order and the Western Buddhist order itself. Led that movement for a while, and although he gradually passed on his responsibilities, he remained a figurehead in many ways until his death in 2018. So during the last year of his life, I was fortunate enough to be able to interview him a number of times, about 7 interviews I had with him in relation to the book. So I was able to get a sort of live impression of his views about things, in the last period of his life, which was all an endeavour to be fair to him in the book. And so the ways I think Sangharakshita is interesting, even for people who are not involved in Triratna or have nothing to do with it, is that he was a pioneering creative synthesizer in many ways. So he took ideas and practices, approaches from Buddhism in the East, brought them to the West, and found ways of reconfiguring both, really, of understanding Buddhism in ways that could be communicated better and help people better in the West. Doing so, he also had some impact, I think, on the West in a wider sense, although he's not a household name, but he is known within a certain section of society. And some of his approaches have I think, had more of a wider influence than maybe recognised. He had a pragmatic approach to a particular situation. That is, he landed back in the UK in 1968, in a time of the ferment of the late 60s. So the flux that was going on then, the new thinking that was going on, particularly, I think, triggered by all the changes that were going on in society, in Western society at that time. So the new freedoms, particularly triggered perhaps by the development of the welfare state in the West, and liberal democracy developing in the West. So in that situation, he managed to find a form of Buddhism that could appeal to, well, particularly what you might call the young elite of that time. So largely middle class people, and largely younger people at that time in Western countries. What was particular about his approach, particularly at that time, was the overwhelming emphasis on practice, and that's what I've often appreciated about Triratna in general. So certainly I learnt from Triratna about practice, and it has this emphasis on practice, which you don't find in many other places, really. Practice is the whole of your life, as the most important focus of what you're doing. And from that, one can understand that other things might help with practice to some extent. So things like ritual, for example, might help with it, but it's practice that's central. And he has a distinctive and an interesting voice in that situation. So I think that could make Sangharakshita interesting for many people, all those sorts of facts. Now, I'm setting out to try and apply the middle way in my approach to Sangharakshita. So let me say a little bit also about what I mean by applying the middle way, so give that some context. So I see the middle way as a principle of judgment. So it's a general guide to making judgments which avoid absolute responses. So that means we need to become aware of those absolute responses on either side, so whether they're positive or negative. And we need to try and put those in a bigger context before we run away with the absolute judgments we might be initially led to make. So that trying to apply awareness so that we don't get carried away in this way by what are often referred to as extremes, apply to all our judgments, don't you? So judgments about both facts and values, for example. But that would also mean that we don't accept absolute assumptions from any tradition. So that would include Buddhism. So one of the challenges with Sangharakshita is sorting out where absolute assumptions have been made in the Buddhist tradition and trying to maintain critical awareness of them. Not always taking at face value sort of assumption that Buddhism can't possibly be dogmatic, because in some ways it sets out not to be. The middle way is also the challenge of the middle way involves even-handedness, so trying not to lean too much one way or the other, to treat the assumptions in one group similar to those of another. So I think sometimes, for example, comparisons with Christianity are quite useful, because it's a way of checking, well, are you being consistent in the way you're thinking about this group, say, and its approach to things? Are you applying the same kinds of judgments to other groups? And provisionality is crucial to applying the middle way, which normally means that it's part of a discourse. So anything one says needs to be subject to further revision. So the standpoint of I'm trying to take in applying the middle way is practical. And that would lead me, applying it to Sangharakshita, to ask something like, is Sangharakshita's thought consistent with long-term helpful practice? Is it consistent with the evidence we have about conditions? Because in order to practice in a helpful way, we need to engage with how the conditions are as far as we can. So not just our assumptions about how things are, but the best evidence we have available to us about how things are. So that's the reason why in my book I draw on science and psychology, for example, as checks on, are some of Sangharakshita's assertions correct if we compare them with other evidence. Also, our own experience can obviously provide another kind of check, but a more limited one than the scientific one. To Sangharakshita's approach is useful just as a model, I think, as an experiment in applying the middle way. But whenever anybody applies the middle way, they're doing it from wherever they start as an individual. So you can be sincerely applying the middle way yourself and reach different conclusions because you're starting from a different starting point. So even though the judgments you're making might be as balanced as mine, hopefully are, you may end up in a different place. So you don't have to agree with all my conclusions for the idea of applying the middle way to be a helpful one to engage in. The method is much more important than the results. So that method involves separating the wheat from the chaff, making comparisons with other sources, not just Buddhist ones, remembering our confirmation bias, looking out for appeals to authority and straw men and so on. So often awareness of the things that can influence us in dogmatic or absolute ways can be helpful. So trying to apply that method to Sangharakshita was particularly challenging because of various aspects of who Sangharakshita was and what he was trying to do. So I certainly found in engaging in discourse with various people about Sangharakshita, preparing my book, that there were there was a polarized discourse going on. On the one hand, there were uncritical followers of Sangharakshita, and on the other, there were dogmatically critical critics of Sangharakshita. So the positive absolute assumptions made by his followers often seem to come from an association, really, between Sangharakshita and their highest values. Yeah, so perhaps because they've learnt from the Triratna movement and from perhaps indirectly from Sangharakshita himself about really practices and approaches that have helped to transform their lives and be very helpful to them. They would associate Sangharakshita himself and his authority with those values rather than seeing them in any way independently of him. So they might express that in the form that Sangharakshita communicated the Dharma. But obviously for me, that raises the question of what the Dharma is and how we understand it. And one of the big dilemmas or issues, I think, in the interpretation of what he said is the universal Dharma versus the traditional Dharma in Buddhism. Yeah, so Buddhism has a set of teachings which are referred to as the Dharma, but the Dharma also refers at times certainly to basically what is just a helpful approach, a helpful set of teachings. And those are, to anybody, those are not always the same thing. Sometimes the traditional approach is not the most helpful one for everybody. Disentangling that can be confusing, and so those who have positive associations with Sangharakshita's teachings will often then end up with an uncritical approach if they associate Sangharakshita himself with the Dharma and don't see what he was doing in a wider context. Yeah, so on the one hand, we've got that. But on the other, there's the negative absolute assumptions made by his critics. So, I mean, the word critical can be understood in two ways. In some ways, I'm critical of Sangharakshita, but I try and balance that criticism. So I try and be even-handed in that criticism. But there are lots and lots of people who react to Sangharakshita. Their criticism stops at a certain point. They don't investigate it any further or apply further critical awareness to the standpoint they're applying. And that's often triggered particularly by the sexual abuse allegations or sexual abuse practices really that surround Sangharakshita. So the label sexual abuse triggers a whole load of assumptions very often. Especially I've found for people who are victims in some way of sexual abuse, that it's, in my personal experience, it's almost impossible for such people to find a balanced perspective, or at least it's very, very difficult for them to find a balance in their response to anybody who's associated with sexual abuse of any kind. So that creates a deep difficulty, deep polarization in the discourse around him. Even though, and there are all sorts of qualifications to be made about the sexual abuse label in the case of Sangharakshita, because it didn't involve children, generally speaking. There are all kinds of details I'm not going to go into now, but yeah, we're not talking about Jimmy Savile, we're not talking about obvious criminality, but we are talking about unethical actions, certainly. So that reaction, that negative reaction, is often comes from other Buddhists or Buddhists from other schools, as well as people in the wider public who may have heard about Sangharakshita. So balancing that, finding a middle way, is a big challenge, which is why I thought it was worth persisting in that task. Okay, so and then the other element of what I need to say by way of preliminaries really is to say a bit more about my personal experience, because obviously that's going to feed into whatever judgment I make, whatever middle way I find myself. So my previous experience of Triratna goes back to the 1980s. So it was 1985 when I first met order members in Cambridge and started to engage with Buddhism through Triratna. And I then had a period of fairly deep involvement in the late 80s, early 90s, when I did actually ask for ordination for the first time. And then I left the movement for a few years in the early 90s, and went away and got married and started a teaching career. But then I re-engaged with it, and I was missing a lot of what it offered, and from the mid 90s, and eventually I, despite various doubts and difficulties, I did eventually get ordained into the Triratna order in 2004. And then I left it in 2008. So I resigned from the order then. So that's now some time ago. That's now 13 years ago. So it feels long enough ago to, it's not about sour grapes as far as I'm aware. I've managed to get some, good perspective on my experiences. So the prime reason why I left the Triratna order was a lack of clarity, really. So there's all sorts of very helpful things going on in the Triratna movement, what things it offers people. But I found a basic lack of clarity in what it stood for. And that really goes back to what I've already mentioned, the contrast between the authority of the Buddhist tradition and the practical requirements of the path. So it was never entirely clear to me which took priority, and there were crucial points where there was a clash of priorities between those two things. If I'd been satisfied that the order made pragmatic use of the Buddhist tradition, but was ready to ditch it when necessary, because that authority was less important than doing the right thing, then I'd have been quite happy to stay and work with all the issues I might have found in Triratna. But because I didn't find its standpoint clear enough, I decided that I wasn't able to continue working with it, which was a shame because I still have a lot of close friends in Triratna. Indeed, I'm married to one of them, so it still plays quite a big part in my life in some ways, and it's a shame not to be a full part of that community. But I don't regret my decision at all. This all interacts, I suppose, with middle way philosophy. So the development of middle way philosophy goes back, in fact, from 1997, really. So while I was still involved in Triratna, but it was always motivated by practical concerns. So how do we justify our judgments primarily? And that led me to investigate, particularly in my PhD studies, a theoretical understanding of justification and how our judgments can get blocked, how we can get stuck in absolute assumptions. So I ended up with this, what seems to be a distinctive approach of absolutization as the problem that middle way tries to avoid. Now, that was very much influenced by Sangharakshita, as I gradually came to realize more and more as I went on. So a lot of that influence had been rather unconsciously absorbed, I think, often via other people in the early days of my involvement and practice in Triratna. And there are some key elements of that. I mean, so one is the emphasis on practice that I mentioned. Another is the idea of integration and the way the idea of integration can be used as to understand the point of practice, really. Another is the idea of provisionality in individual judgment, not just in formal scientific judgment. And another is the use of archetypes. So all of those are things that Sangharakshita pioneered in applying it in the context of Buddhism. That really became part of the way that I developed middle way philosophy, in attempting to develop a sort of universal account of what would be most helpful in our practice. So yeah, that took me to the book as a process of critically acknowledging those helpful elements that I'd got from Sangharakshita, but also sorting out the extent of that influence. Also, whenever I got involved in discussions about Sangharakshita, I ended up in a state of despair at the polarization of that discussion. So it just seemed worth doing as a way of applying the middle way. Okay, so the book, when I eventually wrote it, was primarily based on written sources and long-term reflection. Yeah, so it's not a book of interviews or even primarily about the interviews. It's just that it was supported by those interviews. So that provided a way of checking Sangharakshita's views. And obviously it's much harder to be unhelpfully biased against somebody if you are actually speaking to them, if you've got a live connection with them. So I wanted to challenge myself with that direct communication. So I did get some responses from him about sort of possible criticisms, not all of them, but some of them. And a lot of those are discussed in the book. Okay, so that's a lot of preliminaries really about me and about the middle way and about Sangharakshita himself. But what I want to do now in the time left to me is to attempt that task a bit, well, at least mention some of the major points in my assessment of Sangharakshita. So I can't possibly go into huge detail about this, but you will find a lot more about them in the book, obviously. So I'm going to say something about Sangharakshita's achievements, all the positives, and then a bit more about the negatives or his limitations and mistakes as I see them, in order to try and reach a balanced perspective. So I've already mentioned a few of his achievements. One of them is really personally his courage, I think, in starting a new movement, landing in the UK, coming back from India, being willing to challenge a lot of entrenched interests, so including that of the English Sangha Trust and so on, who were the Buddhist establishment as it had developed in the UK at that point. So he was willing to sort of pursue his understanding of what will be the most helpful way of communicating Buddhism to people in the West, even where that meant challenging traditional perspectives. And he had a lot of emphasis on genuine practice, so he's willing quite often to challenge substitutions for that. Yeah, so it's very easy to start off with a commitment to practice and then gradually slip into some kind of substitution for actually practicing because it's easier. And people can do that as individuals or in groups. So instead of actually practicing, you can get into just reciting dogmas, and so that the dogmas take the place of the practice, if you like. You can get into scholarly distractions, so you can get into ferreting through the Pali Canon and getting all the words right, and that can substitute for actually practicing. You can get into excessive ritual and details of ritual, for example. And he was aware of all those kinds of substitutions, I think. Not that he rejected any of those ways of engaging with the Buddhist tradition wholesale. You know, he did go into scholarship and so on, but he always conveyed a sense of their limitations as well, and was critical of those who took them kind of unconditionally. And he managed a synthesis, though I think an incomplete one, of Buddhist and Western ideas. I think perhaps prime among his achievements is the way in which he used the middle way, at least implicitly, to resolve conflicts between Buddhism and Western approaches. Now you can find this particularly in a neglected lecture of Sangharakshita called 20 Years on the Middle Way, which is available in the free Buddhist audio. There's a set of resources from Sangharakshita called Free Buddhist Audio, which also has a lot of transcriptions of his lectures as well as the actual recordings. So 20 Years on the Middle Way there is a lecture that he gave 20 years after the foundation of the FWBO, so that would be in the late 80s. And there he talks about several ways in which the FWBO had been applying the middle way to actually resolve practical issues. So just to give you one example, he talks about attitudes to parents. On the one hand, he suggests that we should avoid taking the authority of our parents as an absolute and doing exactly what they want of us. accepting their agenda for our lives, for example. And certainly if they disapproved of involvement in Buddhism, then there wouldn't be any acceptance of that, of course. But on the other hand, he did also think that it was important to stay in touch with our parents and to keep engaging with them, and indeed having a loving relationship with them. And that was very important for us as well as for them. It's important for our psychological health in an ongoing way. So there's a middle way to be found there, which we've probably all experienced in our relationships with our parents. A lot of us have just sort of worked that out through practical experience, but it may help many people to have a formulation to fall back on there. So an approach to fall back on, thinking, reflecting on that particular practical issue. So there are lots of practical issues like that where I think Triratna has in practice found a way of applying the middle way, but they don't actually usually discuss it explicitly. Occasionally they do, but it's relatively rare. The middle way is being applied, in order to avoid substitutes for actual practice in many ways. And Sangharakshita also talks about ways that getting obsessed with the concept of enlightenment can be a substitute for practice, or any other aspects of Buddhism as a tradition may become a sort of obsession which substitutes for practice. Perhaps I can share with you actually what's probably my favorite quote from Sangharakshita, where he talks about questioning the absoluteness of a situation. So I'll just share that with you so you can see that quote fully. This comes from his lecture on non-duality. We have to find the entry into non-duality within the situation. How are we to do this? We have to question the very terms of the situation. That is to say, we have to question their absoluteness. We have to realize that it's not enough to try to sustain attention by means of a forcible act of will. If distractions persistently arise within the context of meditation, it means that we have not understood ourselves deeply enough. It means that there are factors at work within us, psychological factors, of which we are not conscious. And what we have to do is to become conscious of them. We have to take them into consideration. In other words, we have to become more integrated. If we are more integrated, the different elements of our being will form an harmonious whole. They will all pull and push in the same direction. They'll no longer be in conflict with one another. We'll no longer have to oscillate between them. So in the case of distraction and attention, integration is the entry into non-duality. Okay, so there really he seems to me to be talking about the middle way, particularly in the context of meditation. And so by questioning the absoluteness of what we experience, and particularly of our interpretation of what we experience, we can carry on giving a wider context of attention to whatever we encounter. And obviously a forcible act of will, as it's called, is one example of having a kind of absolute view of what we're doing and trying to force that on practice. Also there's the integration model is also very clearly present. So the idea that we do have different selves, you could call them, different forces within our experience. Whether you call them unconscious forces or not doesn't really matter, I don't think. We just encounter different aspects of ourselves. We recognize that we have different desires and different beliefs at different times, which can be in conflict with each other. And meditation is in many ways the working ground where we can integrate those different, potentially conflicting elements. And he also recognizes the danger of just oscillating between those extremes. So there were lots of what I would consider to be key ideas about the middle way there. He didn't usually use the term middle way to talk about them. So that lecture uses the term non-duality, which is not one I use very much myself these days because it gets associated with metaphysical beliefs about what non-duality is, etc., etc. And so again, we get a distraction from the process potentially. There's a lot of genuine insights there, which I think have been passed on in one way or another. What I also find, though, is that they're not consistently applied in every aspect of Sangharakshita's thinking. Maybe just to be a bit briefer about some of his other achievements. So he talked a lot about the creative and the reactive mind. Yeah, so the creative mind is the aware mind, which is provisional enough to consider new alternatives, to bring together new combinations of understanding. But the reactive mind is caught in a closed feedback loop, recurring feedback loop, where we go through the same beliefs, which are then determine our understanding of the situation, which then reinforce the same beliefs, the same judgments, and so on. And that's often experienced in meditation hindrances or in any kind of proliferating mental state, like when you can't go to sleep because you've got a thought going round and round in your head. So the reactive loops he talked about extensively, and the ways in which the creative mind could help us to avoid the dangers of those reactive loops. He talked about provisional belief. Again, this is something that's particularly not very developed, I think, in Sangharakshita's thought, but he does talk about it, and it is, you do find it diffused in Triratna, the idea of provisionality. What it does need, I think, is more discussion of the relationship between provisionality and scientific method, which Sangharakshita doesn't really go into. But he also talks about individuality, and that, I think, was a way of addressing the sort of liberal democratic context in which the FWBO arose in the late 60s, early 70s, and thenceforward in the UK. There's a society of people who are quite, they're developing individuality, or quite often they're being individualistic. So he made this distinction between individuality and individualism. He thought individuality was good. In this sense, his approach is in harmony with some great thinkers like John Stuart Mill, for example, who emphasized the importance of individual thought, really so as to be more creative and more provisional in our thinking. But individualism, he recognized as a sort of reactive state where we're simply rejecting what a group says for the sake of it. So where we've absolutized our individual view. So that's an application of the middle way, I think, to the issue of individuality. He also drew on Jungian archetypes in a way which I think set me on the road of thinking about Jung. So the way he used Jungian archetypes was particularly to help post-Christian Westerners to relate to Buddhist symbols, to help them to engage their experience rather than just react to the symbols as something alien. So I do think archetypal approaches can be very helpful in finding a provisional response to religion, which isn't just dependent on dogmatic claims in that religion. He made inspiring connections between art and spiritual practice. There's an awful lot of wonderful stuff about art in Sangharakshita's writings. He gave a lot of emphasis on ethics, the importance of ethical practice, and a lot of emphasis on friendship, and that still continues to have an impact on Triratna, where friendship and community are crucial values. So all of these great achievements of Sangharakshita, I think. But let me spend a little bit of time on his limitations. I'm not going to be able to go into all of these in detail, but so perhaps what I consider the most important one I've already mentioned briefly, and that's the lack of clarity in the relationship between Buddhist traditional authority and a universal effective path of practice. So which is most important? Obviously, quite often there won't be a conflict between those two, but there is often a general assumption, I find, in Triratna and in Sangharakshita's writings, that they must be the same by definition, that what Buddhism tells you must be the universal effective path of practice. And there are some clear cases where he recognizes a discrepancy. So, for example, where Burmese monks support, the terrible treatment of the Rohingya communities in Burma. He told me this was going on at the time I had some discussions with him, and he told me very clearly, this isn't Buddhism, he said. So he recognized that some things that are labeled Buddhist are not the universal practice, path of practice. But he would still want to maintain an essential Buddhism, that he still identifies with the tradition. He believes that the tradition has found that essential path. So there is quite a lot of essentialist thinking in the ways in which he discusses and understands Buddhism. And central to that is the idea that the Buddha achieved enlightenment, and that this provides a source of crucial authority. And his faith in that, or his belief in that, I should say, seems to go back in his personal experience to when he was 16 years old, and according to his memoirs and various times when he's talked about this, he discovered the Diamond Sutra in a second-hand bookshop, and he read it, and he immediately realized, he said, that he was a Buddhist. And that seems to have been a founding experience where he had this deep identification with the Buddhist tradition, which he followed through continuously ever after that. And that provided an unconditional relationship to Buddhist tradition, which obviously helped to inspire him through thick and thin, but also could be a bit of a millstone as well if he was unable to let go of the Buddhist tradition for various points. So there's then a patchy record as to when he's willing to be critical of Buddhist, traditional Buddhist assumptions, and when he isn't. So, for example, he questioned Buddhist tradition in relation to some of the questionable aspects of monasticism. So particularly, he pointed out the hypocrisy in some of the monastic practices in the Theravada that he experienced. Having secret wives but not telling the laity and things of that kind. But there were lots of other things lots of other areas where he seems to me to be kind of stubbornly attached to aspects of Buddhism that he thinks must be right, and he's thus willing to use very ad hoc arguments to maintain that. So those for me would include karma. So there has to be a law of karma, not just karma as a word for consequences, but a law that the moral complexion of your actions must have an equivalent effect. Rebirth, which still he thinks we need to consider rebirth, or it needs to be part of our mental furniture, he says. The historical enlightenment of the Buddha, which is very important to him. The idea of the Arya Sangha, this elite community of arhats who have gained enlightenment and guarantee enlightenment in the future. The tradition of authority in orders. Yeah, so there's still quite a lot of options in the way that Sangharakshita uses the Buddhist tradition, which he, in my experience, he's not willing to question. So that's one important strand of his limitations, I think, that he's not willing to clarify or be consistently critical in his approach to the Buddhist tradition, even though he is, in some ways, for his time, radically critical of certain aspects of it. Just to briefly mention some of the other issues. So he pays lip service to critical thinking. So he talks at times about the importance of critical thinking, but it never becomes a practice which is promoted in any kind of consistent way in the movement he founded. So that may be, there are various possible reasons for that, but that's certainly not been followed through, I think. So the importance of the interaction, the relationship there needs to be between critical thinking and mindfulness, for example, is still not recognized fully enough, I don't think, in the Triratna. Then he he also adopts dogmatic assumptions from some other traditions. So it's not just Buddhism that he sometimes has an unconditional relationship with. It's also quite often Platonism. So he's very attracted to the Platonic way of thinking, thinking of the mind effectively as disembodied from the body, and making the assumption that more integrated states are more disembodied, which I think there's a basic clash there between the understanding that we can get from the scientific perspective or scientific evidence and what he assumes in his understanding of the basis of practice. So Sangharakshita's controversial views on gender, particularly as reflected in the book by his disciple Subhuti, but which reflects his views, Women, Men and Angels, depends on that Platonism, on that idea that to be more integrated, you have to be less embodied. There's a basic conflict also between embodied practices, which are widely used in Triratna, yoga and meditation and so on, and that assumption about the relationship between the body and effective practice. There's also various points, if you look in Sangharakshita's writings, there's all kinds of sweeping and kind of empirical claims about things, particularly about history, about social institutions, about things like marriage, for example. He's convinced that, for example, that modern life has reduced individuality and increased violence, whereas actually the evidence says the opposite. He's willing to go into big sort of speculations without any kind of clear evidence or justification, and then defend that in an ad hoc way as poetic, perhaps. He has a strong tendency to idealize at many points. The idea of integration has a central role in his understanding of the basis of the Triratna order. So you have to have a degree of integration to join the order. But the difficulty with that is that having a degree of integration is not such a straightforward thing that you can identify clearly. It's a very messy thing. Yeah. So as I would put it, integration is asymmetrical. People can be integrated in some ways and not others at various points. So a lot of difficulties with that structure, which are not usually acknowledged. Okay, so that's just a selection of some of the difficulties. In some ways, I've not gone much into the more obvious ones, like the ones related to his sexual practices and so on, but you'll probably find out more of those. There is some discussion of that in the book. So just to conclude then, so how do we hold positive and negative points in mind at the same time? That's the challenge of middle way thinking. So this is turning to be just one example of an attempt to do that. So the best of Sangharakshita's thinking for me implies a practical path that can address the conditions of human ignorance, conflict, groupiness, dogmatism. So all of that, he made a huge contribution in my mind to addressing some of those conditions in human life. But he didn't always succeed in following the path he set out for himself. There were a lot of inconsistencies, which seem to be insufficiently recognized by many of his followers quite often. So the sexual abuse scandals, I think, are just the most obvious indication of the problem, which has stuck out for many people and caused them to react against him. But the sex abuse scandals are due to views about authority, really, which, if he wasn't idealized in the first place, then his sins would not be such a big deal for people. So it's kind of the tip of the iceberg in intellectual terms. But despite that, I think the institutions he founded have great potential to help the world. They just need to clarify their basis and their objectives sufficiently to emerge from his shadow. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to stop recording.